Hello, this is Todd Lewis, your host of The Praise of Folly, but tonight I'm joined with Clement Pulaski, and we're going to be starting a new series, a series of church history. We're going to begin with the post-apostolic age, around 90 AD or ish, and we're going to hopefully cover the era of church history from then up until our present day. And tonight we will discuss the ancient Nicene Christians, which we can date, say, from 90 AD to 325 AD. And then after that, part two, we'll deal with the rest of the patristic era up until the end of the ecumenical councils, which I think is the Seventh Ecumenical Council. So for tonight, we'll start with the patristics. So as a kind of introduction, the early church, of course, was a persecuted minority within the Roman Empire. And it might do well to do a little bit of review on the world at that point in time. So in the ancient Near East at that time, Greek was the common language due to the work of Alexander the Great and the successor kingdoms of the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. And I think it was around 90 BC or something around there, Pompey invades Judea and conquers it from the Maccabees, the people that had ruled Judea since, I think it was like 165 BC, when they overthrew the Seleucid dynasty, a successor site to Alexander. And Judea had been a Roman province locally ruled by Jewish kings like Herod. It wasn't until after the life of Christ that Judea became a strict Roman province ruled by Romans directly instead of indirectly via intermediary Jewish kings. And at this time, the Christians are a persecuted minority within the Roman Empire. And I think that's probably where we want to start. Do you have anything to add, Clement?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on again. I think this topic makes a lot of sense given the podcast that we've done so far. The first one we did was maybe a little out of order. We talked about the Reformation and the Enlightenment and Renaissance humanism and the Catholic countries and everything like that. And then prior to this show, we did a show on ancient Greek, well, the classics in general, but we really focused on ancient Greek philosophy. And that is a big part of setting the stage for the intellectual and cultural world in which the early church grew. So I think that made sense to do that show first, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, definitely. As far as the philosophical milieu, Neoplatonism at this point was the dominant philosophical position for any well-educated ancient Greek or Roman. There were other schools, to be sure, but Neoplatonism was kind of the liberalism of its own day, as far as the universal acceptance.
Yeah, there were a lot of debates. Of course, you had Stoicism, Epicureanism, as we talked about. Platonism and Gnosticism, which was somewhat related to Platonism. And of course, Gnosticism is something that we'll talk about further, dealing with the early church fathers here. Those are sort of the big two intellectual rivals and spiritual rivals that the early church dealt with the Neoplatonism and Gnosticism, which are similar beliefs in a way. They both had a rather negative view on the created world. They both viewed the divine spiritual world as being radically different from the created world, and they both saw matter and material things as being somehow inherently impure, in the case of the Gnostics, inherently evil. The big difference between the Neoplatonists and the Gnostics is the Neoplatonists believed in only one ultimate source for creation, one ultimate source of reality in the universe, the one, or the good. But the Gnostics tended to believe in two deities, an eternal good deity and an eternal evil deity, who were in constant conflict with each other. And
real quick, you might be confusing Gnosticism with Manichaeanism. Gnosticism believed there was one supreme deity called Pleroma or Bythos, and he had many emanations of lesser deities. And according to classical Gnosticism, you had the Demiurge, which, believe it or not, had some sort of spiritual intercourse with Sophia and her own foolishness creating the physical world. Yeah, that's kind of weird. I don't know how to explain that. Manichaeanism Go ahead.
So I'd just say Manichaeanism was sort of a subgroup of Gnosticism.
Well,
I
it's
would say
actually a heresy of Zoroastrianism.
well, but it shared. Well, I guess it just depends sort of on how you classify it. I mean, there's a more general philosophical view about the nature of matter and the nature of the spiritual realm, and that same general idea worked itself out both in Christianity and different pagan religions. So it's hard to say exactly where those beliefs came from, but there was sort of a shared uh, philosophical outlook among various different groups that saw the material world as being inherently evil, and that was a problem that the early church fathers dealt with extensively, where you had Gnostic influenced groups saying things like, for example, that the God of the Old Testament was this evil or defective demiurge, and that the Father that Jesus talks about in the New Testament is not the God of the Old Testament. So that was one of the heresies that the church had to deal with, and that was actually quite prominent at the time. If you look at some of the church fathers from these early centuries, they spent a lot of intellectual effort combating Gnostic beliefs.
Exactly. Some of the most prominent challengers of Gnosticism were Irenaeus of Lyon in southern France, Tertullian of Carthage, and Clement of Alexandria. In fact, Clement failed, but tried to appropriate the term gnosis from the Gnostics, and because gnosis means knowledge, and he tried to reappropriate it, but was unable to successfully do so. When we
Yeah,
think of gnosis, we often think of Gnostics, not Christianity.
he actually used the term Gnostic to refer to advanced spiritual Christians.
Exactly. He failed to reappropriate the term, which is somewhat unfortunate. As much as the cross was a sign of shame and Christ appropriated the cross for something good, Clement tried to appropriate the word Gnostic and gnosis for something good, but he wasn't able to successfully do that, which is unfortunate. But I think something important to bring out is within the early church, as far as doctrine, there's what I like to call two categories: categories of unanimous assent and categories of religious believers in good faith could disagree over. Now, this is where it gets interesting. One issue of which it was very clear that the early church had allowed no dissent was on idolatry. The idea that the possession of images or veneration of images was clearly a violation of the Ten Commandments and was universally condemned throughout the early church. And that's one thing that's pretty easily discovered. Another universal principle is they had very strict teachings on marriage and sexual morality. Divorce and remarriage you couldn't do it. If you divorced a spouse and remarried, you would not be considered a Christian in good standing anymore at that time. That's changed. In fact, I remember R.C. Sproul Sr. once gave a lecture about apologetics, and he said that Justin the Martyr said that no Christians could ever be accused of divorce or adultery. And he's like, well, we can't say that now, but back then apparently that was the case.
Yeah, I think that sort of brings out another broader issue that I wanted to touch on here, which is that the early church had a great variety of beliefs on different subjects, and Christianity in those early centuries does not match up exactly with either Protestantism or Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy. And you often see Catholics, Protestants, Orthodox debating over who has remained most true to the earliest teachings of the church. And the real answer is, well, none of them. I mean, you mentioned the use of images was certainly not allowed the same way it is today in the Orthodox and Catholic churches. But just to reference what I think is a very interesting document, the Council of Elvira, which was held in 306 AD in Spain. In that council, one of the rules propounded is that there shall not be any pictures in churches, so they don't become objects of worship and adoration. And of course, the Protestants see this little snippet from the council, and they think, oh, well, this definitely confirms our position that images were a later innovation. But then if you look at that same council, it also said that all clergy should be celibate, even married ones. Married clergy should not have marital relations. They shouldn't produce children. And that would, of course, please a lot of Catholics who think that clerical celibacy is a necessity, although the Eastern Orthodox Church, as far as I know, has never held that as a strict rule. So in this early period, you had a real mixture of beliefs that don't really fit any current denomination or branch of Christianity.
I'll get to more on that a bit later. Another universally held belief was that's kind of a nested set of values. One of all of which is the rejection of service in the civil magistrate, rejection of the use of the sword, rejection of oaths. All three of those are kind of a nested set of values that was consistently held throughout the early church. Now, the issues that were disputed, where there was a room for Christians of goodwill to dispute, was the millennium. The dominant position was premillennialism, as recorded in Justin the Martyr's dialogue with Trypho.
Well, if I can specify real quickly, not dispensational.
No, you're right. So, yeah, not dispensational. No.
That's.
He does mention unnamed Christians who disagreed, and then of course we know there's another one. I think Hayes from like the 2nd century, who was an amillennialist. But the general consensus of the extant literature was premillennialism, with a kind of acceptance that some Christians might be amillennial, but that was certainly a minority position. Another issue in which there was disagreement was infant baptism. I would tend to argue the majority position was adult baptism. We see in Tertullian's De Baptismo, the first treatise on baptism in Christian history, the injunction that we should wait till the child is an adult before we baptize him. But there are late 3rd century accounts of people moving towards infant baptism. So while there was
Cyprian, in Cyprian, you definitely had an early proponent of infant baptism, where he argued not only should the child be baptized as an infant, but you shouldn't even wait a few days; it should be right away. So,
which is funny. That's exactly the opposite of Tertullian. He said, "Wait till you're old enough." He said, "Wait as long as you have to."
Right. So, if we just touch on or expand a little bit on baptism, this is another one of those issues where Protestants or certain branches of Protestants still debate the topic of infant baptism with Catholics and also with more magisterial Protestants as well. But the debate in the early church on when to baptize was actually quite a bit different from the debate that exists in the post-Reformation era, because in the early church, very early on, there was this belief that baptism was somehow had some sort of magical efficacy, right? That it purged away sins in a way that repentance post-baptism couldn't. So a lot of the arguments in favor of delaying baptism were based on the idea that, well, a young man is going to sin a lot in his teen years, especially he might fall into a lot of sexual sins, so let's wait until he's married and then have him baptized. So a lot of the arguments in favor of delaying baptism in the early church weren't necessarily the same arguments we have today, where the main credo Baptist view today is that baptism should follow repentance. There should be a verbal expression of faith to accompany the baptism, and so forth. And another interesting wrinkle in the story of baptism is we know from some of the archaeological remains from this period that parents sometimes baptized young children only when it was clear that they were near death, because they still believed that there was sort of a special efficacy in baptism, and that even though they weren't able to rationally respond or participate in the baptism, that it still would help their salvation in some way. And that's certainly not a view that credo Baptists today or post-Reformation generally believe.
Well, I think the Pedo-Baptists and the Calvinists and Lutheran camps might believe that, but not the adult Baptists of like the Baptist denomination or the Anabaptist denomination.
Right, that's what I'm saying. There's no one today who... No, I'm sorry, let me clarify. Yeah, certainly there are people who believe that infant baptism is necessary for the salvation of the child, but in the early church, you'd have people not baptize their children in order to wait for them to get older so that they can be baptized after they've gotten a lot of youthful rebellion out of their system. But then when they realize the child is about to die, they'll go ahead and baptize it earlier. So that's a practice that I don't think is found in any church today.
Well, what evidence do you have for that? Because I remember in Tertullian's De Baptismo, I don't think the argument is wait till they've sowed their wild oats. The argument, I think, is wait till they're old enough to give consent.
Well, there's, like I said, a lot of the, there's an excellent book by Kurt Aland called Did the Early Church Baptize Infants? And he talks about some of the archaeological evidence from tomb inscriptions and stuff like that, where, and also in Augustine's Confessions, it talks about how at one period his mother was about to baptize him because he was really sick. He was, older, but then she ended up not baptizing him, and he recovered and became a Christian later in life. But there was certainly very early on this idea of sort of baptismal regeneration that a lot of credo-Baptists today would not accept.
Yeah. Another wrinkle with baptism is the issue of rebaptism.
Mm-hmm.
And while many Orthodox and Catholic Christians do not believe in rebaptism, it's explicitly advocated by Cyprian in his Third Council of Carthage. And believe it or not, it's actually advocated in one of the canons of the Council of Nicaea, with, I think, relation to the heretics, the Paulicians.
Yeah, and that brings up another very significant issue in the early church, which was how rigorous church discipline should be. And I mentioned earlier the Council of Elvira. In that council, it starts off with several pronouncements in those canons where it says that people who commit various sins can never receive communion ever again, even if they're on the verge of death. So that was one of the big debates, was how severe church discipline should be. Should people who, for example, during the persecutions renounce faith in Christ, should they be allowed back into the church or not? Should people who become Christians but then worship idols after their baptism, should they be allowed back into the church? There's also very early on developed a program where being a catechumen was sort of a much bigger deal than it is in a lot of churches, where they wouldn't baptize you right away. You'd wait 2-3 years before you're baptized in some cases. So earlier on in the church, before the church became a state institution of the Roman Empire, there was much more rigor and also a lot of debate over just how rigorous the church should be.
Well, exactly. It is true that prior to Constantine, which will be for the next episode, the early church had a much higher standard of piety for its personal adherents. Tertullian once said that, why should the lay person have a lower standard than the bishop? We're both Christians. We should be held to the same standard.
Right.
That's not something a Catholic wouldn't say that, but that was quite common back in the day. But I think, as far as my study of the early church, one of the issues that is the most controversial and the most unique is the early church's rejection of the use of the sword in the civil magistrate and the swearing of oaths, which until the era of Constantine was a universal prohibition as far as the written literature provides. Let me just quote real quickly from Ronald Sider. He wrote in his The Early Church on Killing, a comprehensive source book on war, abortion, and capital punishment. He says, first, up until the time of Constantine, there is not a single Christian writer known to us who says that it is legitimate for Christians to kill or join the military. One of the key texts that one might provide is the apostolic tradition put together by Hippolytus, who, if I'm not mistaken, was the first antipope. And in the apostolic tradition, he says that he who takes up the sword or becomes a judge or an executioner has rejected Christ. And that's one of the most distinctive and, again, controversial aspects of the early church.
Yeah, and that I don't know how much you want to get into that. I don't share your belief in Christian non-resistance, the typical Anabaptist view on participation in military, police, or um, government, but that certainly was, you are correct that the early church certainly did hold to that view, certainly much more than any later church until the Anabaptists. Although
Exactly.
I guess the Lollards held a similar view too prior to the Anabaptists.
There was during the Hussite revolt, there were three branches: the Taborites, which were almost proto-Calvinists. There were the Utraquists, who were quasi-Catholic, and then there was a third group led by I can't think of his name now, which were a pacifist sect. And those three groups kind of coexisted for a while until they were destroyed later on. But it would seem that if anybody, there's this debate who's most like the early church. In a lot of ways, I think the Anabaptists are the most like the early church. Whether you want to say that's a good thing or not is another issue. But as far as what do the early church believe and what do the Anabaptists believe, is what the Catholics and Calvinists believe. I think the Anabaptists are the most. If you have a 1-to-1 correlation, they have the higher correlation.
Well, but what's the Anabaptist view on the sacraments, though? Because I think very early on in church history, sacramentology was more in line with Eastern Orthodox views.
Well, I would say that Anabaptists take the more traditional Protestant view of signs and symbols that you might get from Zurich. But the idea of 7 sacraments, again, that's for a later podcast, but that was a much later invention.
Sure.
It was just 2. The marriage. I mean, they do believe in the 2 sacraments of marriage and baptism, as do most Protestants.
You said baptism and Lord's Supper, you meant.
Yeah, sorry, baptism. What I'm talking about. Yeah. Baptism and Lord's Supper.
But also, I think another area where maybe the Anabaptists would differ a bit from the early church is on the topic of sexuality, where I don't think, Anabaptists, as far as I can tell, don't have much of a focus on perpetual virginity. I'm not very familiar with Anabaptism, but
well, you're right there too. I didn't say it was a total 1-to-1 correlation,
right.
But what I'm saying is, if you look at all the denominations that exist today, and you start doing a 1-to-1 correlation, you'll find that the Anabaptists have a higher correlation than all the others. It's not identical, obviously.
Yeah, I guess it would depend on how you weighted things, really. But I guess the broader question is, how important is it to be exactly like the early church, when the early church had a lot of issues where they disagreed, and there was a lot of debate as well.
Well, we need to be clear, though. There's only debate on certain issues. Certain issues, there was no debate. And those issues were pretty consistent until Constantine. But you're right, though. There was debate on some issues, the baptism, the millennium, et cetera, et cetera. As far as a more less denominational account, the early church suffered, I think you could argue 4 periods of intense persecution. We had the Neronian persecution, where he blamed the Christians for the Great Fire in Rome. We had the persecution of the Roman Emperor Domitian, who some argue was the beast. Some also argue Nero was the beast, and described in Revelation. And then we had the persecution of Decius in around 250 AD, and the persecution of Diocletian, which was the most extensive and destructive persecution in all of early Christian history, which is around 280s, 290s. Though, to be technically fair, by that point in his reign, Diocletian had devolved rule to lower authorities. Galerius was his subordinate, who really viciously persecuted Christians. And it's funny, before Galerius died of a very painful disease, which many Christians viewed as God's judgment for his crimes, he actually passed an Edict of Toleration 2 years before Constantine's famous Edict of Milan. So technically, it wasn't Constantine that initiated the toleration of Christians. It was the Galerius in 311, who was the subordinate of Diocletian. And it's interesting to note that the Neoplatonic school of philosophy was one of the leading advocates of persecution during the Diocletian era. You had, I think, Proclus. No, not Proclus, Plotinus. Plotinus was actually a strong advocate of persecution of the Christians. So those are the 4 great trials. And it's interesting that Galerius and Decius died at the hand of German barbarian tribes. And I forget what disease he had, but Galerius died of a painful disease. And it seemed as it's kind of an evidence to the Christians that God was punishing these Caesars for persecuting his people.
Yeah, and I think it's important to touch on just why persecutions arose and why Christianity was seen as such a threat to the Roman state. And of course, one of the main charges against Christians, which is strange for us to hear, is that they were atheists. That's one of the things that the Roman pagans called them, because the Christians would not sacrifice to the civic gods. And all of Roman civic life was very religious in the pagan world, where you had different deities and your ancestors and different forces in nature that had to be worshipped and appeased through sacrifice and so forth. And there was a very genuine belief on behalf of the pagans that this sort of reciprocal relationship with the supernatural world of duties and sacrifices and so forth was absolutely necessary for the proper functioning of the universe and for human welfare. So they viewed the Christian belief that you abstain from all worship of idols, from all sacrifice and so forth, really as the end of their world and as the end of religion as they knew it at the time. So it was a very fundamental change in worldview that the Christians represented.
Well, exactly. The Romans were a sacral state. Religion and the state were joined together. The idea that this church and the state should be separate was a much, much later development. And that belief carried into the Middle Ages, where the Catholic and Orthodox churches, again, believed that if you didn't worship the way they did, you were harming the well-being of the state. And the Romans viewed that as deeply subversive, and they killed Christians because of that. And whenever there was floods or invasions or plagues, they claimed, oh, the gods are unhappy because the Christians haven't been worshiping the gods. But one thing needs to be clear, though: the persecution of Christians of the scale of, say, Nero or Diocletian was not the norm. We have the Pliny-Trajan account, where Pliny, a governor of Bithynia, discusses with Trajan that, what should I do with these Christians? And Trajan basically has a don't ask, don't tell attitude. If it doesn't come up, don't deal with it. But if it does, persecute, tell them, worship Caesar, swear by the genius of Caesar, or you'll be punished. So there was a kind of don't ask, don't tell, but if you got caught, you'd be in real trouble.
Yeah, and if I recall correctly from that letter, that brings to mind a lot of the wild accusations that were made against Christians by the Roman pagans, accusations of sexual immorality and cannibalism and all these horrific things that Christians supposedly did in their secret meetings and so forth. And Pliny, I believe, in that letter dispels some of those rumors, saying he hasn't found any evidence of those outrageous practices.
Yeah, I remember one account where they said that the pagans said because Christians view each other as brothers and sisters, they would engage in incestuous orgies at night.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, though. The Gnostics probably did do that, and they called themselves Christians.
Well, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think the general problem with Platonism, Gnosticism, and really any sort of monistic philosophy, whether in India or Europe or wherever, runs into this problem of how the spiritual world and the physical world are supposed to, what the proper relationship is. And so when you think about the Gnostics, of course they denigrated the physical world and matter and said it was evil and corrupt and all that. So you might wonder, well, why do they engage in such unrestrained, sinful activities? And the answer is that there developed a belief in certain Gnostic circles, and this happened again and again throughout the centuries, this belief that we are such pure spirit that it doesn't matter what happens to our bodies. Our bodies can do whatever they want. It's not really sinful because we are pure spirit, and our minds really dwell in the spirit realm, and so what happens to our bodies is irrelevant. And so that philosophical problem of mind and body, which is really sort of solved, I think, and fully explained in the incarnation and the resurrection, that we aren't going to be disembodied spirits, but will be resurrected in our bodies. That was radically opposed to both the materialistic and the more spiritual philosophies of the Gnostics and the Platonists. But there definitely is a connection between these beliefs on the nature of physical reality and behavior, and so maybe that's why some of the Romans were suspicious of Christians in that regard.
Well, exactly. One interesting aspect of the early church was Peter Brown. He was a famous scholar of the Patristic era, what he calls late antiquity, from around the time of Diocletian till around the time of Charlemagne. And in this period of late antiquity, which he's pioneered studies of in history, he wrote a chapter in a history of magic. And he dealt about the Patristic era, and specifically Christianity. And he argued that in the ante-Nicene church, Christianity marketed itself as a witchcraft-proof cult. That if you joined us, you would be protected from the evil eye, from curses, and from witchcraft. And he argued that many pagans who were afraid of what would happen if they got cursed or whatever, they felt that if they joined the Christian church, they would derive protection from these, through God himself, of these demonic powers. And after Constantine, this idea that the church is this body of people resistant to demonic oppression is gone. And you end up with weird doctrines. Like there's one doctrine that said if you didn't eat an onion the right way, you might swallow a demon. That was like a medieval belief in magic. It was really weird. Or like if you had relations with your wife prior to a feast day, you might be opening yourself up to possession, which Peter Brown ties to a latent pagan holdover. But prior to Constantine, there was this strong idea that if you became a Christian, you were a new creature, and that you were resistant and protected from demonic oppression. And it was a very powerful appeal to the pagan world, which was steeped in this kind of, how we say, not quite nihilism, but despair. This despair of the futility of life, and the danger of these capricious gods that might curse you. And the church said, no. If you become a part of us, you'll be safe. No more curses, no more evil eyes. You'll be protected. And that was a very powerful draw to the people around them. Another powerful draw was their sort of humanitarianism. In the ancient world, the value of human life was negligible. If you were poor, a woman, a slave, you had no value. Only a utilitarian value of what you could produce. And if you got sick or were in danger, don't expect anybody to help you out. Sucks to be you. But for the Christians, people who were sick or slaves or women or elderly or of low social standing, they would reach out to them. And they would, and one of the common complaints by pagans was you were a religion of slaves and women.
Right.
And yet the religion of slaves and women conquered paganism. So
right. Yeah. A few things that come to mind there. I mean, yes, as an example of Roman views towards the value of human life, Cato, I believe it was Cato the Elder, who of course is the sort of archetypal Roman practicing self-denial and self-mastery and mastery of others and so forth. And he recommended that you work a slave until he's old and then you sell him. So he didn't like this idea of you have a faithful slave who serves with you his entire life, and when he's old, you don't just give him some simple job or take care of him in his retirement. You sell him to someone else who will work him even harder or whatever. So I mean, it's definitely correctly characterized it being a very utilitarian view, and in my mind, the most striking example of early Christian philanthropy has to do with taking in children who are exposed. The big issue today in this area is the debate over abortion, which is, of course, infanticide, although people today tend to somehow think that if you kill the child in the womb, because you can't see it, so it's not a big deal. But in the ancient world, there was a very casual attitude towards exposure of children, which is the child is born, you don't want to keep the child. Either it's deformed or defective or seems too weak, or you just don't want it or whatever. You could just go. It was kind of strange. I mean, they wouldn't kill the child outright, but they'd expose it to the elements and just kind of let it die on its own. I don't know if they thought that was somehow more nature taking care of it rather than them actually killing the child, although they clearly were. But Christians became known for taking in these abandoned children who were left to die, basically.
There is one interesting thing to say, though. The Greek pagan doctor Hippocrates, who gave us the Hippocratic Oath, says he will not commit an abortion. So there were some pagans that were not quite okay with that idea.
It was a very common practice, though.
You're right. It was
exposing children both amongst the Greeks and Romans, and you even had, I think it was Theocritus, who was a Alexandrian poet, if I recall correctly, who gave a very casual account of women talking about whether or not to expose the child. So it was, as you mentioned, human life. Well, of course, they had blood sport too in the arena,
the Colosseum,
with the gladiators. So I mean,
I think Ovid actually criticized infanticide. He likened Roman women to being more vicious than the tiger.
I'm not familiar with that particular passage from Ovid, but yeah, there certainly could be some dissenters, but it was a practice that was not eliminated until Christianity came about.
One of the interesting things is there's a sociologist and historian called Rodney Stark, who wrote a very interesting book called The Rise of Christianity. And this is, it covers the ancient Nicene era, and he's giving an account of why Christianity was so successful and flourished. There's one interesting argument is in relation to both humanitarian charity and their sexual ethics. He argued that with the high mortality rates, not just infant, but just high mortality rates in general in the ancient world, any medical care, no matter how primitive, would greatly increase your longevity, because any attempt to improve your condition would bear benefits over the long run, given that basically nobody took care of you at all. And so he argued that Christians, by adopting unwanted children and by taking care of the sick and the elderly, actually were able to grow faster demographically than their pagan competitors. They were more competitive when it came to populations. And coupling that with their strict sexual mores, unlike the Greeks and Romans, who believed that while women should be chaste on the marriage night, there was no such requirement upon the man. He could, a classic example is Ulysses in the Odyssey. Penelope is praised for her faithfulness to her husband, but Ulysses spends the whole time sleeping around with goddesses, women, and water spirits. Whereas in Christianity, it was expected that, no, you shouldn't do that. And by encouraging monogamous relationships and taking in the poor and the sick, their population grew far more rapidly than their contemporary pagans around them. And that's one aspect that he ascribes to the rise of Christianity. It's a more efficient system.
Yeah, I would generally be somewhat skeptical of utilitarian explanations for why the church grew, but God certainly does work through means, and His commandments to us can cause us to flourish in this world, not just the next. So certainly is a plausible explanation.
If you want to use it as an explanation to get rid of God, there's a problem. But
Right.
I do think, though, that God's laws are actually utilitarian. They actually are the best way to live and will maximize your success.
Yeah. Well, perhaps over the long run for society in general. And of course, the New Testament message is largely about bearing your cross and suffering in this life as well, without necessarily receiving any temporal reward. So yeah, it's a balance, I guess, because it's true in both respects.
Well, like I said, as a whole, right, the whole society benefits. I mean, you might die, you might be eaten by lions, but as a group, as a society, these values cause you to prosper.
Mhm.
And they I think they could be an element in explaining one of the key and most obvious elements of the early church was its martyrs. And a great deal, even Fox in his book of Martyrs begins with the early church. And I think one of the famous martyrs is Perpetua and Felicity, the woman and her female servant who were thrown to the lions. And what's so, I think, surprising and encouraging is the supreme courage witnessed by women and children. You know, we think of, okay, men are physically stronger, they're more likely to be courageous in times of adversity. But what we see with the Spirit of God is that even women and children, or old men, I mean, Polycarp was an old man in his martyrdom, people who are physically weaker and infirm show a level of fortitude and courage that would make even a Roman legion, a Roman legionnaire bow his head in respect.
Yeah, well, it just was a fulfillment, really, of the promise in the New Testament that God would use the weak things of the world to overcome the strong. And the amazing growth of the church in those first few centuries, I think, definitely was a strong evidence for the truth of the Gospels.
Exactly. The early church as well was more willing to accept the active agency of clean and unclean spirits in our world. In contemporary 21st century America, it's not really acceptable, even amongst many Christians, to accept the active agency of clean and unclean spirits on a regular basis. But in the early church, it was widely accepted. In fact, they claimed the gods of Rome were just demons in disguise. And they weren't surprised at all at these accounts of heroes and demigods. They ascribed them to demonic powers. And they expected to see, in their own miraculous rescues from, danger, the hand of God, in a way that we might not ascribe today.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear from the New Testament that unclean spirits are a very real part of our existence in this fallen world. And much of what used to be ascribed to demonic influence is now dealt with using the secular science of psychology. But Christians, I think, should certainly be aware of the reality of the devil and his angels, and that they are always trying to lead us astray. The spiritual warfare is a very real thing on a daily basis. And I think there's a tendency in modern Christianity to really not talk much about the devil. I'm just thinking of sermons I've heard either in churches or on the radio. There's not a lot of talk warning you about the devil anymore. Certainly not compared to earlier times.
Related to our earlier podcast about the classics, there was a great debate in the early church of how you interpret the Greek classics, how you utilize Greek philosophy, or should you utilize it at all. And typically this, as we are told, the debate is framed between the people who were pro-philosophy, mainly from the Alexandrian school, people like Clement and Origen, and then later down the patristic era. And then the early opponents of this, I guess, Hellenizing, if you will, were the Carthaginian Christians, primarily Tertullian, but also Lactantius, and to some extent Cyprian. And that was a very live debate at the time, which was finally resolved in favor of Greek philosophy in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, I think we can't really do a show about the Ante-Nicene Church without talking about Origen a little bit, who is probably one of the more fascinating figures in church history. Origen was a great scholar and theologian, teacher in Alexandria represented really the culmination of the Hellenizing tendency in within Christianity. And the fascinating thing about Origen is that he was, well, he certainly had opponents during his lifetime. He was also very, very widely respected, both in his generation and in subsequent generations as well. And it wasn't until something like 200 years after his death that the church decided that he was a heretic, when he had been so widely respected and accepted by so many people during his lifetime and afterwards. So just to mention some of the key points about Origen that people should know about, he's known for developing a very, most would say, radically unbiblical view on the origin of the soul, where he had this idea that when confronting the question of evil and why is it that God creates some people to, why does God decide that some people will be born into less fortuitous circumstances? How come some people are born to pious Christians and some people are born to pagans on the other side of the world who will never hear the gospel? How is God just in that situation? And Origen's one of his, well, to be fair to him, hypotheses on why that happens is that all souls existed prior to the creation of the physical world, and each individual soul turned away from God to a lesser or greater degree. And the souls that stayed faithful were made into angels. Souls that maybe were slightly rebellious could be born into a Christian family, and then be assured of, or have the chance for salvation during their lifetime. And if you were a really horrible, bad soul, you'd be born into a horrible situation where it's very unlikely that you'd ever achieve salvation. And then also, so the complementary idea in this theory of his was that eventually there would be full salvation for all the souls in the universe. That is, hell would be more like a purgation, a refining of the soul until it comes to love God as much as the saints do.
Hell is purgatory.
Right, who come to Christ in their lifetime. So that was the idea that Origen's really known for, as being sort of wildly off base, the pre-existence of souls and universal salvation. And then in addition to that, he developed a highly abstract and allegorizing method of interpreting Scripture, where every little bit of Scripture has some sort of hidden spiritual significance, which to an extent is true. There is typology in the Scriptures, where you have the ark pointing towards, well, I guess both the cross and baptism, crossing the Red Sea pointing towards baptism in the New Covenant, or the Old Testament sacrifices pointing towards the sacrifice of Christ, and so forth. So typology is a legitimate form of, and really necessary form of biblical interpretation, but Origen and others in his school of Hellenizing Christianity took it to extremes, for sure.
Yeah. I think, though, to be fair to Origen, we might want to end with a positive note, and I'll be reading a footnote from Ernst Jünger, the German stormtroopers, book On Pain, page 16, footnote 24. In his church history, Eusebius reports of Origen's letter to his father on martyrdom. But as there was nothing else that he could do, and his zeal beyond his age would not suffer him to be quiet, he sent to his father an encouraging letter on martyrdom, in which he exhorted him, saying, "Take heed not to change your mind on our account." This being recorded as the first evidence of Origen's youthful wisdom and his genuine love of piety. So he may have been confused, hopefully
Right.
not terminally confused, but he did when it counted, encourage standing tall for the faith, even in the face of adversity.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy, or it's kind of strange in a way for people, including most Protestants today, to continue to refer to Origen as a heretic, because I mean, the council in, I believe it was the 5th or 6th century, that determined that Origen was a heretic certainly would have considered all Protestants to be heretics as well. So maybe a little unfair to refer to him as a heretic. and it is true also, to be fair to him, in his work, I believe it's the De Principiis, where he lays out this theory of the preexistence of souls. He does seem to hedge it as a hypothesis. He certainly doesn't think that it's a necessary belief or doctrine for the church, but it's sort of an explanation, in his view, of to explain the problem of evil and unfairness in human situation, and that might be a good thing to talk about briefly too. Of course, one of the major debates within Christianity from the Reformation onward is, or I guess maybe even earlier than that, is the question of God's sovereignty and salvation, and the question of free will. And from my reading of the Church Fathers, especially the Greek Church Fathers, I would say all of them are decidedly Arminian, although it's kind of strange to use that term for them. But really, a lot of them were almost semi-Pelagian. I mean, the degree of autonomy that man in his fallen state was granted by many of the Church Fathers, especially the Greek Church Fathers, is not anything like you've seen in Western Christianity, probably since Augustine onward.
Well, in early Christianity, prior to Augustine, no Christian that we have records of argued that man's will was bound or constrained or in the way that Augustine would later or even Calvin and Luther would later articulate. They were decidedly both East and West on the pro free will side. Now, the Catholic Church did some, funny interpretation later on to claim that Augustine didn't really mean what he said, but that might be for a later podcast.
Right.
But you mentioned salvation. In the early church, there's the two dominant expressions of salvation were the Christus Victor account of salvation, and the ransom theory of the atonement, which is different from penal substitution, which is common in both Catholic and Protestant circles. The Christ the Victor theory is that the world is governed by the dark forces of demons and the devil, and they actively oppress mankind and the world. And by rising from the dead and saving men's souls, Christ had conquered these demonic principalities and powers and had given us the ability to defeat them. And the ransom theory of the atonement goes to the fact that there's often been a term called the Great Deception, where Christ deceived the devil. The idea was that if you've ever read the Chronicles of Narnia, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Aslan's ransoming of Edmund is a very good allegory or description of the ransom theory of the atonement. When man rebelled, as the witch says, Edmund is mine because I have all traitors are lawfully my prey. And, all traitors, of which all men are lawfully the devil's prey. And much like Aslan, Christ has to die has to take our place so that the devil will renounce his claim on us, like the witch renounces her claim on Aslan. And they think that by killing Christ that they can then defeat God's plan. Of course, Aslan does not die. He comes back and defeats the witch. And those two are, I think, predominant positions in the church. The penal substitution doesn't come around until Anselm 1,000 years later.
And just to go back a little bit too to the issue of free will that I mentioned, certainly not any Calvinistic expression of theology in the early church, but I think it could be argued reasonably that a lot of the early church fathers were semi-Pelagian. So just to clarify briefly, so Calvinists believe God's totally in control of salvation. He chooses whom he wants to save, and after that choice is made, the individual has no power to accept or reject the salvation. They're going to be saved no matter what. And the Arminian view is that man is totally depraved and can't do anything towards his own salvation. He can't even ask for help. It has to be prevenient grace. It has to be the Holy Spirit speaking to the soul and trying to convince it to accept salvation. But then the semi-Pelagian view, as I would understand it, is the idea that even in his fallen state, man can, through his own powers, ask for help from God. And you do see that expression in some of the church fathers. Macarius, the Egyptian, is one I can think of right off the top of my head, where he talks about man being able to instigate salvation, in a sense, by crying out for help from God, and then the grace of the Spirit comes and helps him. So
probably also Maximus the Confessor, a later father. I think he might have held a similar position what you're describing.
Yeah, well, I know Chrysostom did too, and Maximus, I think, was much later than that. That was more 5th century, I think.
Yeah,
a bit later. But yeah, he was certainly another heavily Platonizing church father. But that seemed to be quite prevalent, as I said, especially in the Greek church.
Well, is there anything else that you want to say about the early church before we close?
Maybe just briefly to say, as a Bible believing Christian, the study of the early church fathers is very important and very interesting, but ultimately it shouldn't be the foundation for what we should believe. We should look at God's word as the only infallible guide and rule of faith. And if you look at Old Testament accounts of the nation of Israel, it's possible for corrupt human traditions and opinions to spring up very soon after divine revelation is given, almost instantly in some cases. And the same thing happened in the early church era, when the oracles of God were given in the New Testament writings, and human interpretation began to misinterpret them very early on. So that's the only thing I'd want to emphasize in closing.
Before we close, I do want to ask you a question, though.
Sure.
Would you, as far as the apostles communicating the truth of the gospel and Christianity to the next generation, I think you would have to agree at least that while some early Christians might have been in error, that within the tradition, we would be able to find the pure gems of the gospel, because the apostles directly passed it on. I mean, the odds of the apostles failing completely to pass it on is really, I think, not really something we should consider.
Sure, but the odds of someone in the first generation after the apostles, like a Polycarp or someone, misinterpreting what the apostles said, I think the chances of that are quite high, at least in some small respect.
Well, but if that's the case, then the reformers would be even more likely to misinterpret it.
Well, that's maybe a debate.
I mean, if you're going to make that argument, then you'd have to say that Luther and Calvin were far, far more likely to misinterpret it.
Well, why more likely?
Well, why? Well, you're saying let me put it this way: if I were to ask you, if you were to do a research project on, say, Caesar's invasion of Gaul, and you were to say, what's a more reliable source? A contemporary source, be it Caesar's own Gallic Wars, or say someone's a medieval account written in the High Middle Ages. Well, obviously we'd say, okay, the medieval account may be correct, but given as far away as it is from the original source, it's more probable that it's been corrupted. And the closer you are to the events that are described, the less likely it is to be corrupted.
In this case, the original source is the revelation of God, and through the Holy Spirit, we have that revelation in the Scriptures the same way that the early generations of the church had. So I don't think we're farther.
So you would this sounds similar to the philosopher Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard mentioned that some people say, if only we lived in the time of Christ or immediately after, we would have immediate access to it. And Kierkegaard says, well, we do. And while we're not living in the first century, Kierkegaard argued that we all have that same first century immediacy. Is that kind of where you're going?
Yeah, I mean, all of God's direct commands and all the direct inspired words written by the apostles, unless books have been lost or something, we have in the same sense that the early church had. And I think actually, well, this might be a good topic for when we get to the Reformation. I mean, my view is that in the post-Reformation age, we do have a better understanding of theology than the Christians did in the first few centuries. And I think that's largely because, looking back at church history, we're able to see man's liability to err and to allow human inventions and human traditions to enter the church. So we're able to be more on our guard than the early Christians were. And I think as an Anabaptist, you would probably agree, because you mentioned that no current tradition of Christianity lines up one-to-one with the ancient church. Wouldn't you say that the Anabaptists are interpreting scripture more accurately than a lot of the people who lived in the 2nd or 3rd century?
I would say yes and no in certain instances. And again, like you said, this would be a very good discussion to flesh out and when we get to the Reformation. And I think I might want to wait for both of us to flesh it out more there. But we're out of time now, so I'd like to thank you again, Clement, for coming on. And again, this is our first podcast on church history. Hopefully we'll be able to do a series of podcasts up to the present age. So thanks for listening. Bye-bye.